Did you know that Russia is betting nearly $200 billion on a gamble hidden in the frozen lands of Siberia? This is not about building a simple pipeline or a small drilling site. This is about creating a whole new world on top of some of the most dangerous land on planet Earth. We are talking about a place where the temperature can drop to 50 degrees below zero, where the ground is as hard as iron, and where the wind can cut through your skin like a knife. Yet, in this frozen hell, Russia says it will build new ports, new towns, and new airports just to pull oil out of the ground. The scale of this plan is so huge that it makes some of the biggest projects in the United States look small. But why would anyone spend so much money to go to a place that everyone wants to leave? And how can they possibly build anything in a land that stays frozen for most of the year? Today, we are going to explore the complete story of Russia's crazy plan to conquer the Arctic and take the oil hidden under the ice by the year 2035. The story of this giant gamble starts not in the cold, but in the heat of global politics and money. For a very long time, Russia has made most of its money by selling oil and gas to the world. Just like the United States has big companies that find energy to power homes and cars, Russia has its own giant companies that do the same thing. But there is a big problem. The oil fields that Russia has been using for the last 50 years are getting old. They are like a well in your backyard that starts to run dry. You have to dig deeper or find a new place to get water. For Russia, the new place to get their water is the Arctic. Scientists and geologists have looked at this part of the world, and they believe that under all that ice and snow, there is a massive treasure. They think there could be billions of tons of oil hiding under the seafloor. Some estimates say the Arctic holds over 400 billion barrels of oil and gas that no one has found yet. That is about 22% of all the undiscovered oil and gas in the whole world. And Russia controls the biggest piece of this frozen pie. So the idea was simple in the beginning. If the old wells are drying up, go north and find new ones. But getting to this treasure is not as simple as driving a truck to the beach. The person who had to make this crazy idea real is a man named Igor Sechin. He runs a huge Russian oil company called Rosneft. A few years ago, he went to meet with the most powerful man in Russia, President Vladimir Putin. In that meeting, Sechin had big news. He told Putin that work on a giant new project was starting. This project was called Vostok, which means east. But this was not just a small drilling job. Sechin promised to create a whole new oil and gas province on a frozen piece of land called the Taimyr Peninsula. This place is the very top part of Siberia, sticking out into the Arctic Ocean. It is one of the most empty and lonely places on Earth. There are no roads. There are no towns. There are no people. There is just ice, snow, and wild animals. So to get the oil out, Russia realized they could not just send in a few workers. They had to build civilization from nothing. Think about what you need to live. You need a house, you need food, you need power, you need a way to get from one place to another. In the Arctic, you need all of these things, but they have to be built to survive the cold. The plan for the Vostok project is not just to dig holes in the ground. The plan is to build 15 completely new industry towns right there in the frozen wilderness. These are not fancy cities with parks and shopping malls. These are places where workers can live, sleep, and eat while they work to get the oil out. They also need to build 2 new airports. Planes cannot land on ice and snow forever. They need real runways. And most importantly, they need to build a giant oil pipeline that will stretch for 770 kilometers. That is almost 500 miles of pipe that has to be laid across frozen ground that cracks and moves when the temperature changes. Building a pipeline in Texas is hard work. Building one in Siberia is a challenge that most engineers would say is impossible. But the pipeline is only half the story. Once you have the oil, where does it go? You cannot put it on a truck. There are no highways. The only way to get the oil out of the Arctic and sell it to the rest of the world is by ship. So Russia has to build a brand new giant port on the northern coast of Siberia. This port, called the Sever Bay Terminal, will be a place where huge ships can come and fill up with oil. But there is one tiny problem with sending ships through the Arctic Ocean. It is full of ice. For most of the year, the ocean up there is a solid block of white ice. Normal ships cannot move. They would get stuck and be crushed. To solve this problem, Russia is relying on its special power, icebreakers. Russia has the biggest fleet of icebreakers in the world, and they are the only country that has nuclear-powered icebreakers. These are like huge, powerful trucks of the sea that smash through the ice, making a path for the oil tankers to follow. The plan to develop the whole Arctic region, including this new port, involves spending nearly 2 trillion rubles just on the sea route itself. That is about $34 billion from the government, and they hope private companies will put in even more money, bringing the total to something like 216 billion euros when you count everything. This is not just an oil project. This is a project to change the map of the world. So we have this giant plan to build cities, ports, and pipelines in a frozen wasteland. But who is going to build all of this? And how do you even start when the ground is frozen solid? The answer is people. A huge number of people. The leaders of this project have said that the construction alone will need 400,000 workers. That is almost 500,000 people going to live and work in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. To give you an idea of how big that is, imagine the entire city of Miami getting up and moving to the North Pole to build things. These workers will have to deal with months of total darkness in the winter and months of constant sun in the summer. They will have to work in temperatures that can freeze the skin on your face in minutes. And they have to build everything perfectly, because if something breaks in the Arctic, you cannot just call a repairman to come and fix it the next day. Getting there takes weeks. All of this work is happening for one big reason. The Vostok project is expected to hold about 5 billion tons of oil. That is a number so big it is hard to understand. When this project is fully running, the people in charge say it will pump out 100 million tons of oil every single year. This oil will not just be for Russia. They want to sell it to the world, especially to countries in Asia and Europe. This is where the Arctic Ocean becomes more than just a frozen desert. It becomes a highway. Russia is spending billions to develop something called the Northern Sea Route. This is a shipping lane that goes right along the top of Russia, from the Atlantic Ocean near Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean near Asia and the United States. Usually, a ship going from China to Europe has to go south, through the Suez Canal in Egypt. That trip takes about 35 days. But if you go through the Arctic, using the Northern Sea Route, it could take only 18 days. That is half the time. For global trade, saving that much time saves a massive amount of money. So, Russia's plan is twofold. First, they pull the oil out of Siberia. Second, they put that oil on ships and send it out to the world using this new Arctic highway. They are building new ports along this route, like one in Murmansk and one in Arkhangelsk, to handle all the traffic. They are even building special ports to handle something called LNG, which is a super-cooled gas that can be shipped like a liquid. But there is a catch. A huge catch. Remember how we said the ground is frozen? Well, it is not just frozen dirt. It is something called permafrost. This is ground that has been frozen for thousands of years. It is as hard as concrete. But when you build things on it, or when the climate gets warmer, this frozen ground can melt. And when it melts, everything built on top of it sinks, cracks, and breaks. Pipelines can burst. Buildings can fall over. Roads can turn into mud. Building on permafrost is one of the hardest engineering challenges in the world. Engineers have to figure out how to keep the ground cold, or how to build things that can move with the ground without breaking. It is like trying to build a house on a giant ice cube that is slowly turning into water. And there is another problem: money. The whole project is expected to cost 10 trillion rubles, which is about $111 billion for just the Vostok oil part. The bigger plan for the whole Arctic could cost much more. To get that kind of money, Russia needs friends. They cannot do it alone. So, they are inviting big companies from other countries to invest. We already saw that a company from Singapore called Trafigura bought 10% of the Vostok project. There is also interest from countries like India. But this is where politics gets in the way. Remember that after Russia started a war with Ukraine, many countries, including the United States and those in Europe, put heavy sanctions on Russia. These sanctions make it hard for Russian companies to buy the special technology they need for Arctic drilling. They cannot get the right equipment, and they cannot easily get money from Western banks. This has slowed everything down. For a while, some experts thought the whole idea of getting Arctic oil was too dangerous and too expensive. They said maybe Russia should just focus on the older, easier oil fields. But Russia has not stopped. They see the Arctic as their future, and they are moving forward, even if it means doing it alone. To make sure this plan works, the Russian government is doing everything it can to help. They are passing new laws to give tax breaks to companies that work in the Arctic. They are spending billions of rubles just to look for more oil and gas. They want to make the Arctic the engine that drives their country for the next 50 years. But there is another side to this story. A darker side that has nothing to do with oil and everything to do with power and control. Because when you go to the Arctic to get rich, you have to be ready to fight for it. When you look at a map, the Arctic at the top of the world looks like a big empty space. But Russia does not see it as empty. They see it as their backyard. And just like you might build a fence around your yard to protect your things, Russia is building a military fence around the Arctic. This is where the story of oil becomes a story of war. The plans for the Northern Sea Route and the oil drilling are not just business plans. They are part of a bigger strategy to make Russia safe and strong. The government released a special document called the Arctic Strategy that says developing this region is very important for national security. That is a fancy way of saying they are willing to fight for it. So, while the workers are building oil towns, the Russian military is building bases. They are building new nuclear submarines that can carry weapons and hide under the ice. They are building new ports for their warships. They are even testing drones and new ways to communicate in the freezing cold, so their soldiers can talk to each other if there is a war. They are building a military empire up there. Why would they do this? Because the Arctic is becoming more valuable. As the ice melts because of climate change, more ships want to use the Northern Sea Route. More countries want to find oil and gas. Russia wants to make sure that if anyone comes up there, they have to ask Russia for permission. They want to control the highway and control the gas station. But building all this military stuff is expensive. And right now, Russia is spending a huge amount of money on a different war, the one in Ukraine. You might think that would force them to stop building in the Arctic, but it seems they are doing both. They are finding ways to keep building in the north, even while they are fighting in the south. They are using science as a cover for some of their work. They send scientists to study the ice and the water, but the military uses that same information to figure out how to move their ships and hide their submarines. So, when you see a Russian ship in the Arctic doing research, it might also be mapping the ocean floor for a future military mission. The clock is ticking toward 2035. That is the big target date for all of this. By then, Russia wants to have its new oil fields running at full power. They want to have the Northern Sea Route crowded with ships. They want to have built all those new towns and airports. But there is a big question mark hanging over the whole thing. Can they really do it? The challenges are enormous. The cold, the ice, the melting ground, the sanctions, the cost, and the war are all working against them. Some experts think that big oil production in the Arctic will not really start until after 2035 because it is just too hard. They say the old plan was too optimistic, and now Russia is being more realistic. But the Russian leaders do not seem to be slowing down. They believe that the future of their country depends on this frozen gamble. If Russia wins this gamble, the world will change. The United States and Europe will have a new competitor in the energy market. Russia will have a new way to send goods to Asia that does not go through any other country. They will control the roof of the world. They will have new money to spend and new power to use. The oil that comes out of the Taimyr Peninsula will heat homes and fuel cars all over the planet. But if they lose, if the project fails or the cost becomes too high, it will be a disaster for Russia. All that money, all those workers, all those promises will be buried in the snow. And what about the rest of us? When you burn oil, it releases gases that warm the planet. And when the planet warms, the Arctic ice melts even faster. This melting ice is exactly what allows Russia to go get more oil in the first place. It is a strange circle. The more we warm the Earth, the easier it is to get the oil that warms the Earth even more. Environmentalists have been yelling about this for years. They have asked the Russian government to stop giving out licenses to drill in the Arctic. They say it is too dangerous. If there is an oil spill in the Arctic, cleaning it up would be nearly impossible. The oil would get trapped under the ice, and no one could reach it. The animals, the fish, and the whole ecosystem would be destroyed. But in the race for money and power, those voices are often ignored. So, as we look to the year 2035, we are watching a giant experiment. Russia is trying to do something that has never been done before. They are trying to turn the most dangerous place on Earth into a factory. They are sending hundreds of thousands of people into the darkness and the cold. They are building cities on ground that could melt beneath their feet. They are sending warships to guard the ice. And it is all for the black gold hidden underneath. The story of Russia's Arctic oil gamble is not over. It is being written right now, in the freezing wind, on the shores of the Siberian coast. Whether it becomes a story of triumph or a story of disaster, only time will tell. But one thing is for sure, the world will be watching, because what happens in the frozen north will affect the temperature of our entire planet.